Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Title Success powered by Bo Digital webinar. We're excited to have you guys here with us today. Today, we're going to talk about communication during and after your merger or acquisition. This is a topic that we get lots of questions on. It's not as sexy as valuations or joint ventures or how do I finance my mergers or acquisition, but we think it's just as important. As we go along in the recording today, please note that you can use the chat function to ask any questions of Pat or myself as we go along here, and we'll get to those. Also, the webinar is being recorded, so we will send around a recording sometime next week for you that has everything that you need to know there. And whether you are an agent or an underwriter or a vendor, I think we've got lots of different information that we can give to you here today. But I always tell folks, be selfish with your time. You signed up for this and you're here with us live. So please be sure to ask questions to make this useful to you. Most of you know me. My name is Wayne Stanley. I'm the owner of Bo Digital and a partner in Title Success here. And today I've got our CEO of Title Success, Pat Smith, with me. And Pat, I'll let you introduce yourself to these guys.
Thanks, Wayne. I appreciate it. As Wayne said, my name is Pat Smith. I am a longtime title insurance operator and an attorney, and along with Marcus Hunt, co-founded Title Success back in 2019. Our company focuses on title insurance agency consulting, especially mergers, acquisitions, and valuation work. We've been our pleasure to have Wayne as our partner now for several years. One of the things that we work with our clients in doing is making sure that we encourage and assist with necessary communications before, during, and after the acquisition process. And that's what we're going to share with you all today. And as Wayne said, if you have any questions, let us know. We'll also provide you with my contact information during or at the end of the webinar, so you can reach out to me whenever you happen to watch the recording and ask me any questions that you may have then.
Awesome. Well, Pat, let's get started with an easy one for us, which is the biggest pitfall in communications during a merger. We know that a lot of people don't always think about the communication side of it. Like I said at the beginning, people are first worried about how much am I worth, and then how much am I going to get, and figuring out all that out. So what are some of the biggest pitfalls in communications during a typical merger?
Well, I think that we can kind of analogize a merger, whether it's coming together of two companies or even an acquisition of one company by another. We can kind of analogize that merger to a wedding. And my older daughter is a wedding planner, and so we have discussions about this from time to time. And one of the things that she's commented on as she's worked with brides, grooms, mothers, and others involved in his wedding is that everybody seems to get very concerned, very interested, and very involved in the party, but they don't take the same amount of time and the same amount of energy to discuss the marriage. Right. And I think that we see an analogous situation to that in our mergers and acquisition work, is that it's easy for the buyers and the sellers to get really caught up in the valuations, the EBITDA adjustments. They get caught up in multiples and discounted cash flows and due diligence, and you get caught up in the transaction. And we risk overlooking the human component of that transaction, which is the communication not only among the buyers and sellers as to what the transaction will result in, what does the company look like after the closing, what's everybody's role going to be, what are the accountability and responsibility functions, how are we going to communicate this to others. So I think the biggest pitfall we see is a kind of a solitary focus on the transaction without taking into consideration the need for several different forms and levels of communication between the parties to make sure that once the transaction takes place, everybody is able to recognize the benefits of the transaction, um, which is why they got into it in the first place.
Right. Which is hard for some of them to think through, right?
Well, it is, and again, it's easy to get caught up in that transaction because this is what we came together for. But putting those communications off, or not scheduling those communications early in the process, is going to result in important discussions being foregone. We're going to, we're going to have an acquisition. Money's going to change hands. We're going to assign ownership interests. We're going to assign, we'll transfer shares of stock. We're going to do all of these things, and then we're going to look at each other and go, now what? Well, at the time you say now what, that's the time when your newly merged company is most vulnerable. News of this merger, news of this transaction will hit the title insurance community immediately. Doesn't have to have a press release. We'll talk about that later, but it's going to hit immediately. And if you're not prepared during that vulnerable time in this transaction, you're going to see competitors. You're going to come in and try to hire your employees. They're going to see that as a time when they're concerned, where they're maybe not sure what's going on. And if you're not very careful, if you're not very intentional, very deliberate, you end up in a situation where, as a purchaser, you don't have what you thought you were purchasing because the communication was poor, the announcements were not well planned, the discussions with employees were not done in a way to reassure them. And now, if you buy a company with 10 or 12 employees and 6 or 7 of those decide to go to brand X, you've really lost a great bit of the value that you thought you were acquiring. So the biggest problem that we see is lack of communications, and the next biggest problem I think we see is poor timing. They don't think ahead and don't start to lay out those scripts and put those processes in place, and to go ahead and design those communications and have those ready to go when the time comes, and know when to have those communications with different groups.
Right. Well, so we talked about the worst, the pitfalls here. What are the best stories? What are the best things that can come out of this? Who's doing it? We don't have to name names, of course, but we know we've had some that have done this a lot better than others. So what are the successes here?
We were fortunate to work with with clients back in the fall of 2022. Was a fairly good sized merger for us, and it was a merger. Our client acquired some large majority of the target company, but the way that the purchaser and the sellers went about the transaction was really very healthy. What they did is they turned the number crunching, they turned the doc prep, they turned the mechanics of the transaction over to Title Success and to the seller's attorneys. And so Title Success is representing the purchaser, and the attorneys representing the seller. We spent a lot of time just talking through documents, just going over numbers, going through financials, and getting explanations for that, and the other thing. While we were doing that, which is what we feel like we do well, and then the attorneys on the other side were very good and easy to work with, we took a lot of that technical part of the transaction off of their plate. And the buyers and the sellers took that time to have some lengthy conversations about what their vision was for the combined company. They spent a lot of time talking about the individual employees of the target company and what they did and why they were valuable and what they were being paid, and how they were being paid, and how did we go about ensuring that those key employees of the company wanted to stay there after the acquisition. How do we communicate this to them at the right time and show this as a very positive development in everybody's career. There were a lot of conversations between the acquiring company and the current ownership group who were staying on about what their role was going to be, what was their what are the responsibilities, what were their authority, and what was the accountability built in to make sure they were doing a good job. So here we are now, 2+ years into that, and that buyer group and the ownership group are still having these very healthy, very timely conversations. There was no employee loss once the merger went through. The synergies that the companies had identified as being beneficial for the merger have continued to be realized, and it's just a really good example of how to go about getting the transaction done while still making sure that the conversations are occurring. That was a success story, and I like talking about that one a lot.
Yes, because some of them just don't, and we'll talk about this later. Some people don't, they work so hard to get to day zero of signing and making it official. They don't focus on everything after that. And so it's nice to see when they've got that mindset from the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about pitfalls and successes, but we also know that there's even worse than the pitfall. There's some horror stories still, some that just don't get it right and for years have problems there. So maybe go into that a little bit too. Again, we're not naming names on this, but we've got some horrors that we can talk about.
No names, parts of the country, or anything else. But yeah, we were more recently involved in a transaction that that kind of didn't take those same turns. And I had a former law partner, a very wise guy, wise person who says that hindsight's 50-50. And this was one of those where, in hindsight, looking back at the transaction, there were some red flags that would have, could have, should have been dealt with during the negotiation and during the due diligence process, but weren't. And I think looking back on that transaction, what was happening was that both the buyer and the seller in that deal were so anxious to get the deal accomplished that that they chose to ignore these red flags and chose to put off having discussions about what the post-merger company was going to look like. I think they chose to gloss over or maybe set aside some what would have been difficult discussions about what the post transaction management was going to be, who was going to be responsible for what the restrictions and what the accountability measures were going to be on the current management that was staying on board. And again, I think that was driven by the fact that the seller needed the transaction to occur, wanted the transaction to occur, needed the infusion of capital or just the cash that was going to bring to the seller. The buyer was in a position of wanting badly to grow, wanted to expand and wanted to grow, and latched onto this opportunity and brought it to us to review. And it's just, instead of dealing with those issues during the due diligence phase for fear that an inability to resolve them might tank the deal, they chose to kind of set those aside and get the deal done. And then afterward, we're still faced with some really difficult discussions and problems that are continuing to have to be worked out between them. And that was a horror story, or an example of the other side of the success story of what happens if you don't have the communications that you need to have about what this new entity is going to look and act like.
Right. Well, that brings me to the question that I talked about just a second ago of how do you start planning for day one when the focus is on I always call it day zero, the closing and all of that, because
Right.
there are some that are so laser focused on getting to that point, whether it's for just the pure victory of a merger acquisition or the financial wins of that or whatever it may be. And then they get to day one, and sometimes they call folks like us and they're like, we have no plan to talk to our customers. Our employees don't know. all of that can be a mess. So I know I've got some stuff I can share here, but from your perspective, Pat, when should they start planning for day one?
Okay, so if we talk about day zero as being closing, and day one being the first day you walk in with a new company, I think that the time to start planning the communications, both with customers, with your team members, with vendors, with underwriters, with all of your constituents. The time to start planning that is like day minus 90.
Mhm.
And I say that because that's typically where we see the letter of intent signed between the acquirer and the acquired to kind of formally start the due diligence process. Uh, I mentioned to you earlier, Wayne, that from the time I was a baby lawyer, and this was back before the days of Excel spreadsheets, anytime I was working a transaction, I would use a big chart, and it would
Mhm.
have all of the documents, everything that had to be prepared and approved and signed with that transaction will be down the left hand side, and across the top would be timelines for when those things needed to happen and who was going to be involved in those, and we would keep track of it diligently all the way through the process to make sure that the transaction was on schedule. And I still do that today. When we're doing a merger and acquisition transaction, I use Excel. We make that spreadsheet. We do all this. But I think there needs to be another tab or another section of that spreadsheet, which is communication schedule.
Mhm.
And in that communication schedule, starting and continuing during the due diligence period, is um, how are we, as the new ownership group and the new management group, how are we going to run and manage this company? Sometimes the last thing that happens before the closing is you agree on what the new operating agreement or the new bylaws are going to be, but that's a little bit late. So to start having that discussion between the people that are staying on, the people that are coming in, about who's going to be responsible for what, who's going to have ultimate authority over what, um, how are we going to make sure that we're not micromanaging, but at the same time we're getting the feedback and the metrics, the data that we need to manage. Those discussions need to happen simultaneously with the financial statement review, the operational review, and all the other due diligence that's going on. Once we get past that and we start to get closer to the to day zero, now we're starting the documents are starting to take shape. We've probably agreed on what final sales price. Um, we need to start talking about when do we begin to communicate to the team or teams what's happening. And I mentioned to you, and most of the transactions that we've done, they've been small to mid-sized companies, which is kind of our where we live.
Mhm.
There are one, two, three people in the company being acquired that are pretty essential people.
Right.
They've been there a while. They know all the process, know the procedures. They have the relationships. We got to figure out when we're going to bring those people in, because those folks are going to be key to the success of the merged company. And we want them to be on board. We want to be able to discuss with them what's going to happen post merger. We want to make sure that they're wanting to stay around and give them reasons to want to stay around. Um, at that point, once they're on board, we need to talk about how are we going to roll this out to the employees of both companies. I mentioned that day one is probably the most vulnerable position of the merged company.
Mhm.
And part of that's because when you announce that transaction, the employees of both companies, but especially the employees of the acquired company, now suddenly are very nervous. They know from things, conversations they've had with people, that when this happens, often people lose jobs and they get very nervous. So we need to plan what the communication is going to be to the team, how that's going to be made, who's going to make it, um, what the setting is going to be. You know, we need to figure out how we paint this as a positive and affirming event for all all of the constituents. And at this point, I think it's really a great idea for the acquiring company to get professionals involved. And I mentioned that I was going to put in a shameless plug for Bo Digital, and I'm going to put it in right here. This is where working with Bo Digital or someone with their skill set and expertise is worth their weight in gold. Because they can start helping design the communications, helping design the delivery media, uh, putting together what that message is going to be, so that I don't have to deal with it. I'm tied up in spreadsheets and numbers and documents and red lines and what have you. The buyers and the sellers still are trying to operate their respective businesses on a day-to-day basis while we're pulling all this together. Everybody's time is crunched. So bringing in somebody like Bo, who this is what they do, and paying them to help design this communication package is really a valuable thing to do, and needs to be built into that timeline of when events happen. What did I leave out? Maybe,
Uh,
maybe one communications.
yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you said for sure, especially hiring Bo. But aside from that, I think that one of the things that we get asked about is, do it surprises me how often we get brought in to a relationship where we find out, oh, we merged 2 years ago, we merged a year ago, or something like that, and they say we're still having a hard time getting the previous owner to transition the brand. We hear that a lot, and it blows my mind because I don't think that should be a conversation a year into a merger or acquisition. And so I think my advice to a lot of folks is, if you are somebody that's out there purchasing companies, if you're the one being the acquirer, you should have a very set in stone agreement of that timeline that Pat's talking about with communication, to say, this is how it's going to work. Eventually, if it's part of your deal that the name is coming off the door or off the building and being something else, there has to be a timeline for all that. There are a lot of feelings mixed up in a merger and acquisition for a lot of people, especially the kinds that we work in, because we're working in that small to mid to, a little bit above that, transactions. And it's very emotional for some folks, and that's fine. It can be emotional, but if you've got a set in stone, this is the way we do this, or this is the way we're going to do this, everybody knows how to follow the plan. And then you don't run into, we're 365 days in and we're still calling it by the old name. Our customers are confused because all of our paperwork has the new company name on it. Our employees are confused because their paychecks has the new company name on it, but everything else seems to be business as usual. And there's a lot of opportunity for your competitors to have a lot of fun in that kind of chaos and confusion. And you don't want that. And so that's one of my biggest pieces of advice to folks, is to make sure you've got a set, this is what our external, whether you want to call it a launch, communications plan, whatever it is, this is our expectation for how externally we are going to roll this out. Even if some of it doesn't have specific dates, if it's 1 month in, that's when website changes happen, 2 months in, or when we transition social accounts, whatever any of that, all those small pieces look like, that's the kind of stuff that usually gets left until after everything's signed on the dotted line. And sometimes everyone's got their hands up, like, who's in charge of this? I worked hard to get us to this point. Who's supposed to take us from here? And if you don't have that figured out, you're just asking for more problems.
Before we started Title Success, I was involved in merger and acquisition work on the real estate brokerage side. I was in-house counsel for a large real estate broker who had an appetite for acquiring smaller companies. And over time, we kind of developed a formula for the transition and rebranding. And what that formula consisted of is the 8 o'clock the next morning, after the transaction was closed, the new sign went up on the branch with the new brand. We met with the agents that morning at 9 o'clock. We had them new yard signs with the new name and logo. We had them new business cards. We were immediately ready to flip a switch on their URL so that the website went to our company site. We tried to make all of that happen, as much of that as possible happen right then. And as you said, Wayne, people get very emotional about these brands that they've created and these companies they've created, to the point to where they're even reluctant to sell, not because they don't want to sell or get out of the business, but they just can't. They feel like they're, letting go of their baby.
Right.
So that's good to remember. If you're on the acquiring side, you're dealing with a very emotional time for a lot of these people. But to speak to your point, the faster you can get that brand updated, the faster you can get the new materials and get the communication out. I think that's better. And you mentioned talking to customers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just like a merger, a new merged company can be like blood in the water to your competitors, to being sharks, and they're there trying to pluck off your premier employees. Don't think that every owner and sales rep in your area is not going to be trying to go after your customers. So this is where, again, working with someone like Bo, who is so skilled at communications with the customers, so skilled with the social sites, the website design, getting out press releases into all of the trades, having that ready to go on day one, and picking up the phone and having those communications with your key customers is vital. You don't want your customers to hear about this from your competitor who calls them up and says, "Hey, did you hear about XYZ title? Man, I don't know what's going on over there. That must be really a shipwreck if they're having to bail out and bring somebody else in like that." When in reality, it was the owner has spent 40 years building this brand and wanted to be able to retire and go ride horses in Montana or something, and it was just time. But
Right.
your competitors will paint that in, it's like politics. They'll paint it in the worst possible light to try to advantage themselves.
Yeah. Um, Wendy down here says that at one point in her career, she worked for a title company that was publicly traded, and when there was a merger acquisition, she found out on the news. And is there a better manner to communicate with employees before it hits the news? Um,
Absolutely.
it
You're
doesn't
little,
matter if you're publicly traded or not. I would say I've seen
yeah.
title companies that have 5 people that they don't find out until somebody's scraping the name off the door.
Yeah. I think that again, it's a fine line, and you have to really weigh this all. Up until the time you close, there's always that possibility that something goes awry.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, having somebody walk in the next day and find out there's a new owner there is really stressful, and like Wendy's point, really causes a lot of angst and anxiety. So I think that regardless, there is a point before the closing where it's time to call everybody in, make an announcement. Guys, here's what we're doing. And here's the key: why we're doing it, why it's a good thing for all of us, and why uh, you should be on board and excited about it. As soon as they hear that there's a merger in the works, anxiety level goes through the roof. So we need to be able to bring that down, to talk them through it, get them off the ledge a little bit, but they know what's going to happen before it actually happens. Because heaven knows that our industry, as hard as we try to keep everything in our little tight knit, controlled environment, there are times when things leak.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had a transaction once that got tanked because one of the bankers involved made a comment to the target that was involved as the acquisition target. And she was so upset that the banker knew about it that she more or less pulled the deal off the table. So we know that there are likely to be leaks. The last thing you want is your employee to hear about this from somebody that works at the bank or works somewhere else, that this was happening and they didn't know it. So go ahead and work with your communications professionals to create a way to promote this acquisition, bring everybody in, have some swag from the new company, something nice like some polos or some quarter zips or golf balls, or whatever excites or might interest your employees, to help them see that this is not something to fear, but something to value and to look forward to.
I would agree. And there's some too that, like Pat said before, there are certain people that your inner circle may grow as you go throughout the whole process of the transaction. And so there may be a few people that know at one juncture, and then there are more that need to get brought in to be told about what's happening. And there are some that do massive NDAs and things like that. They're hard to enforce, but there are legal ways of letting your broader team know ahead of time. But Sorry that was your experience, Wendy. Unfortunately, it's not super uncommon, but um, that goes a little bit into the last question that you and I had there, Pat, was just telling your team in general and things that people should be aware of. Like, you talked a lot in the past about people that are very worried about, do I still have a job during this? The main things that they care about are what's changing. Is my pay changing? Do I have a job? All that kind of stuff is big. Is there anything else that people should be aware of when they're thinking about how to talk about this to their team internally?
Well, yes. So one of the unfortunate byproducts of mergers and acquisitions often is that there are employment changes. There are sometimes some people who are not retained. We try to have that done before the acquisition takes place, so that if you're there on the day of the acquisition, you can be assured and feel good that your position with the company is secure. That is not always the case. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But I think the biggest thing and the key there is to sell the employees on the benefits of the transaction, not only to their prior owners, and we hope that they would wish us well as a prior owner. We hope that our employees see that this is something that is a positive for us, something that we've worked hard to be able to do, and that we are looking forward to what our next chapter is. And we hope that they will join us and be happy for us in that transition. At the same time, they're nervous. So we want to talk to our employees and say, the value of the type of company that we have is sitting around this table. We all issue the same title policies. We all get research from the same plant. We all have the same underwriters. The real distinguishing factor between us and our competition are the people sitting at this table and the people sitting in this room. And that's what interested our new owners in this company. There were a lot of title companies in this area that they could have called, but they chose to talk to us, and they've been through the due diligence and they've looked at, your employment histories, and they've cases maybe gotten to know you, and they wanted to move forward to buy this company so that they could have the benefit of your services. That kind of message helps give them some comfort that they are valued, that they are important to the future success of the company. It's often good to have the new owners, come in and say, look, guys, we're glad to have you. You're a key part of our success going forward. You're not going to see any day one changes in compensation or whatever. We want to take time and talk to you about your benefits that we bring. We'll want to talk to you about the way we do our compensation plans, the way we do our bonuses, because it may be a little different from what you're doing now, but we want to make sure that you know that you're valued and that we want to make sure that you are happy being here and that you want to stay, because we know you got a choice. And being able to design your communications around that sort of conversation goes a long way towards helping those rank and file team members know that they don't need to be circulating their resume.
Right. Well, that is plenty of communications talk and a very complicated transaction here. But if anybody has any questions specifically for Pat and I, please let us know. I know that this is usually a personal conversation for folks too. So as always, if you'd like to have a brainstorm meeting to talk with us about specific things that you're thinking about, if you're in the middle of an acquisition and are thinking about the communications side of things, we're happy to chat. If you're looking for acquisitions to have, we're happy to chat. It's also important that I do a plug for a new tool that we're going to be launching soon called Connections from Title Success, which will allow us to have a buyer's network for all the folks in the country that are looking to buy title agents, and have a listing side where agents that are for sale will be able to list themselves for sale. So if you know of any agent that is looking to sell right now, We are allowing them to join the platform for free as we launch. They just have to get in touch with Pat or myself, and we'll help them make that happen. And we'll have more news on that launch in the coming weeks here. So if you're watching this recording, our email addresses for Pat and myself will be included on that email that we send around. Feel free to get in touch. And I don't see any other news or any other questions here, Pat. So I think we're good for today. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much. I look forward to working with some of you folks in the future, and look forward to getting to know you. Thank you.
Thank you all.